Good morning and welcome everybody. Welcome to this plenary session, The Realities We Face, Social Inequality and Natural Hazards in a Time of Pandemic. In the call to action in Lori's description of this year's workshop theme, she asked the question, how can we maintain hope in this era of environmental extremes? And she goes on to ask, can our community set an agenda for a resilient future even while so many are stuck in seemingly endless cycles of disaster, loss, and disruption? Many of us, Lori and I, believe that a strategy for a way forward is contained in the book, Active Hope. How can we face the mess that we're all in without going crazy? Quite a title, eh? Active Hope is a text that both Lori and I have studied, discussed, and even debated at length. This morning, we all had the privilege of hearing a truly amazing presentation from the book's co-author, Chris Johnstone, in the keynote that concluded just 30 minutes ago. The session you're about to participate in aims to offer a realistic picture of the realities we currently face: extreme weather events, rising natural hazard losses, the tragic disparate impact of disasters on our most vulnerable population, COVID-19, and regrettably, much, much more. Just recently, the United States hit its $10 billion disaster, 10th $10 billion disaster earlier than any year in record. As Lori said this morning, risk is outrunning us. We're running out of adjectives. So, as you've already heard from Chris, Active Hope is a three-step process. First, establish a clearer view of reality. This is where scientists, engineers, and practitioners gather and analyze data and evidence to characterize the threats and challenges that we face. That's step one. That's what this session is about. As Chris mentioned earlier, we need to know where we want to go. Otherwise, we don't know how we'll get there. Step two, use that clear view of the present circumstances, our reality, to identify solutions we can envision. And in what direction would we like to progress to occur? And what changes would we like to see made? And then step three, and this is where it gets really interesting. Take active steps to move ourselves and those around us in the direction that we envision. These steps may start small and involve sparking changes in individual attitudes, values, and behaviors. They also could transition to a grander scale and ask what systemic transformations in our policies and institutions are needed to avert rising hazard losses and increase collective resilience. So, enough background. This morning, we will hear from 5 speakers. During their presentation, you'll have the opportunity to enter your questions and comments into the chat function in FeedLoop. As you enter your input, you may choose to direct your comment to a particular speaker or to the panel as a whole, your choice. We're hoping for lots of questions and comments, and I've been told that will not be a problem. You can identify yourself or remain anonymous, also your choice. At the end of all the presentations, the speakers will have an opportunity to hear your questions and comments and respond to them. As you listen to each of the speakers, you might consider the following questions. Are you seeing these realities in your community? Is anything happening in your community to address any of the root causes or consequences of disasters? So now, on with the show. To lead off, it is now my pleasure to turn the podium over to Natalie Grant. Natalie is the Director of the Office of Human Services Emergency Response in the Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families. In her position, she oversees the Disaster Human Services Management mission for the agency and the department. Natalie will speak to the reality, what disasters reveal. Natalie?
Great, thank you so much to everyone that has joined us virtually for this very important and timely session. Right now, we live in an unprecedented time of risk and vulnerability across communities throughout this nation. From the context strictly of a disaster, the challenge that lies ahead of us is very much at the intersection of a disaster threat, the community risk profile, and the individual pre-disaster of vulnerability. So all 3 of those pieces are part and parcel of the exposure risk and the threats that we see as we move forward in the disaster response frameworks. I would posit that complex emergencies acknowledge that there are layers to a disaster. So that is to say, an emergency is not just a singular thing, but when you layer various aspects of community, of the situation and scenario, it moves from a quote unquote run-of-the-mill disaster to a complex emergency, where the hazard in and of itself represents a singular threat, and then when compounded, collectively represent a catastrophe or a complex emergency, that thing that is outside of what we would traditionally imagine in our response framework. So the reality is really and truly what the disaster reveals. From my vantage point, it is very much about understanding that communities are not this or that. Individuals are not this or that. We are this and that, or we are this because of that. I think that there is a challenge put to us as disaster managers, as researchers, as we try to tease out causality without understanding and appreciating how those interconnected pieces actually impact communities. In a similar fashion, communities are not a blank slate, and what we encounter in the aftermath of a disaster is very much reflective of this reality. So when we are right now where we sit in a moment with multiple cascading disasters, much is being revealed. I think it is revealing what members of various community members, that various communities have been trying to demonstrate for so long, in that the devastating impact of disasters are just revealing some of the pre-existing vulnerabilities and conditions that predispose a negative outcome. When our social fabric is frayed and when inequality is at its worst, when we see families that are suffering, when the capacity to provide services is diminished, we will then experience greater challenges to responding to disasters. I think part of this analog in identifying what this means for the lived experience and the connected nature of the lives we lead is through intersectionality. And I know that some of you are familiar with that framework, in addition to the social determinants of health. Specifically on the intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw's coining of the term and really framing of the experience of how race, class, and gender and other individual characteristics literally intersect, and then how that intersection engages with our day-to-day lives is also represented in a disaster context. I think that there's an opportunity to explore that further in some of our disaster research. In a similar way, the social determinants of health model and that intersectional framework model are truly very important to help us understand, better target our resources and our efforts to identify where the disaster risk lies most extreme and those that would have the most negative outcomes. Low-income families, children, racial and ethnic minorities, medically fragile people, the list is extensive. Knowing and understanding what that means and looks like can assist us in better addressing not only the immediate and ongoing disaster impact, but also in looking towards transformation. I'd say that many of our non-governmental organizations and other parties are accustomed to picking up the slack, and in this COVID environment, we know that they are stretched to the max. And because of the complex nature of this type of emergency and the emergencies we're facing, there's not one singular party or entity that can take up something so diffuse and global on its own. The federal government cannot be effective on its own without communities. So I think that's really, just to pivot, is really the tremendous opportunity that we have in front of us. As a disaster manager, I would not be in this business if I did not have hope in and believe in the strength and opportunity of people. Folks across communities are rethinking what's possible, not only in the aftermath of the disaster, but as they are responding to it. They are taking control and taking agency to identify how they can innovate, how we can work together differently to address those systemic issues of vulnerability and support those communities that are predisposed to negative outcomes and disaster-caused harm. I think the community level interventions will be the most critical to generating concrete actions and transformational change in the years ahead as we confront a changing landscape of disasters. As our systems are stretched to the max, I think as we partner as a federal government, non-government, individual, community level, faith-based research practitioner community, the challenge that lies ahead of us is to understand the various perspectives and taking that understanding to action, providing that model, providing those resources to the community members so they can act, so that those puzzle pieces coming together can assist and support all of us in addressing the root causes of disaster and move towards a disaster harm reduction goal-oriented framework that then says we are not only responding to this incident in question, rather we are moving forward to create communities that are reflective of the values and the supportive networks that we seek in the period ahead. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Natalie. Next, it's my pleasure to turn the podium over to Shirley Laska. Shirley is Professor Emerita of Sociology at the University of New Orleans and co-founder of the Lowlander Center, a center that supports lowland people and places through collaboration, advocacy, and applied co-research. Shirley will speak to the reality. It is shifting too quickly, literally under our feet. Shirley?
Are you able to see it?
Yes, we are able to see the slide. Thank you, Shirley. Please proceed.
Of the morning. Do I need to adjust its location or everything fine?
If you click play from start, it should go into full screen. Perfect. That looks beautiful.
Okay. Good morning, all of you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this panel. I think the messages that we are going to be sharing with the audience are very, very, very similar. About 3 weeks ago, when I was turning on my favorite jazz radio station in Newark, it's a public radio station, so it has news and other stories. I saw this article that Terrence Blanchard had written. He's a very famous New Orleans jazz trumpeter who has done the scores for all of Spike Lee's movies. So I'm sure you've probably heard of him. And I wanted you to see his thoughts. It's a precious moment in time when many hearts, ears, and minds are now open to listening. My theme for my brief presentation this morning is to state and try to demonstrate that this applies to us applied social scientists and other practitioners who are in this world of trying to make a difference for all the issues that we've already been exposed to this morning and are part of our work experience. 2004, Kathleen Tierney, when she was director of the center, had a series called Disasters Waiting to Happen. And she had asked me if I would write the last one. Being in Louisiana, we're always good for another disaster because we are just so fraught with them here. And I told her yes, and then while writing it, Hurricane Ivan occurred and almost reflected what I was drafting. It did turn, and therefore we were not struck by it, but I incorporated it in the message that I gave to Kathleen to publish. August 29th, I was evacuating, and Kathleen, of course, was directing the center and starting to brace herself for the media that she would experience. Well, certainly she did, and this piece was one of the items that they were interested in because of the degree to which it had predicted the reality that was unfolding. I was evacuating, I was seeking shelter. I didn't speak to anyone for a while until the reporters were able to find where I was. It was in Lafayette at a colleague professor's house. And they asked me, how did you do this? How did you know this? And at first I was stunned. I wasn't sure how I had done it. And then I started to realize that as an environmental sociologist turned disaster mitigation specialist, I had specialists in my professional world who had all of these studies and were making these observations. And all I merely did was integrate them. But what I started thinking about was the fact that I had to be thinking and integrating in order to produce the article. And that was not something that I had been taught to do as a scientist. So the topic became, it got in my craw, and I have been pursuing it in some respects ever since. And this is what is the recent publication, and you can read it. It's a book chapter, and it's just do ground zero and my name. And what I did after Katrina, about 6 years after, is I interviewed the other social scientists who were at ground zero from, excuse me, from the western part of Louisiana to the eastern part of Mississippi. And I found some remarkable observations on the part of these scientists. Here they were themselves victims of this disaster, and yet they also saw themselves as being in a position to do their best research. They were interested in the quality of their research. They considered their research challenges, and I especially focused on the word witnessing because I wanted to know how that made a difference. And the scientists said that they indeed had changed their ways of doing research, their attentiveness, and their commitment to having and making a difference with their work. And I think that's, again, to repeat, that's the theme I'm considering. They found themselves grounded in place as they did their research. Now, there's a relatively new program funded by NSF called SEER, which is headquartered here at the Natural Hazards Center. And you can see the map of where people are located. I think this is a very important project because it creates a geography for the participants. And if you'll notice where I have the green arrow, the purpose is to identify and connect social science researchers to one another, to their teams, and to communities at risk. I would propose that the 2 communities at risk should be the first goal, with the other 2 being almost givens. And that's what I like about this, is the recognition that scientists, especially those of us who do disaster work, need to be connected to our communities. Now, Laurie asked me if I would link that theme to the issues of climate change. And unfortunately, here again, Louisiana is the target of many events that have been happening in this realm. So what I've been studying is 2 concepts: never happened before events and layering of multiple events. The never happened before, here are 2 of them. One is an attempted resettlement of an indigenous community to a new inland location. I say attempted because it has not come to pass in the way that the tribal community envisioned it. And my lesson for myself and my colleagues at the Lowlander Center and others is that it's probably not appropriate to direct efforts at first to at-risk communities. That when something has never happened before, we have to be careful to make sure that we don't subject those at risk to even more risk. The second never happened before is the collision of a hurricane storm surge and the flooded Mississippi River. I think you can imagine what that will look like in the overtopping that will occur in the urban center of New Orleans, but also other areas. Again, the vulnerability of the lower income residents of the city is just huge because the city cannot call for an evacuation as they could for a hurricane. So these are 2 examples of events that when you look at them, you have to be really careful to see, as in Terrence's commentary. And I really think that we've got to practice seeing. Now, the layering effect is shown here, where when we were first doing this work, after Isaac, we were able to simply model in this fashion, showing that there was, of course, a reduction in the recovery, especially the reconstruction, with the next disaster that occurred. And then when Isaac came, it was only a 1 or 2 category storm, it had such an effect that it harmed the recovery from the oil spill. So we have a lot to be studying in this regard. But this is the one that sort of blows your mind away because of the magnitude of the layers. This is the seafood industry and harvesters in the Gulf of Mexico. Working class, indigenous, African-American, traditional history communities. And all of these things have happened to them in the course of the 15 years that I've indicated. That they are still harvesting is, I would say, a miracle, but I'm going to turn that around and say it's due to the strength and capacity to adapt that these communities have. I'm going to end with this COVID slide, and this is new. I put it in here because I was stunned by what happened on Saturday when our governor, John Bel Edwards, was speaking to the entire state about the spike that we are having. And in the course of that conversation, he said to the audience, now remember, it is not New Orleans that is causing the spike. My sense is, in terms of my theme, that what the governor should have said, and look at how well New Orleans has done. The city of New Orleans is a majority minority, 60% African-American community with the highest poverty rate of all 50 largest cities in the country. It also has a housing crisis such that people are jammed into small shotgun homes, and they're multi-generational, and they're also frontline workers. And with all of those qualities, look at the strength of the line versus the entire state. So I really think that this sort of strikes me to say we have to pay attention. We have to know about these communities. We have to know how they adapt and how they're resilient. We can't simply write about them as if they were distant examples of vulnerability. So my message is very simple. I think we should be spending more time exploring our research topics before we put our shades on and go into the theories and the hypotheses. And I think that's honoring with excuse me, with what Mr. Blanchard and the whole African American movement of Black Lives Matter is telling us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shirley. Next up, it is now my pleasure to turn the podium over to Michael Mendes. Michael is an assistant professor of environmental planning and policy at the University of California, Irvine. A member of the National Academy's Board on Environmental Change in Society, Michael's research focuses on the intersection of climate change and communities of color. Michael will speak to the reality, invisible populations. Michael?
Thank you, Howard. And it's such a pleasure and honor to be here today to be speaking with you. And I'd like to thank Dr. Lori Peek for this invitation. I'll be speaking to you about my forthcoming journal article in GeoForum, The Invisible Victims of Disaster, Understanding the Vulnerability of Undocumented Latino and Indigenous Immigrants. As climate change advances, communities across the United States are adapting to the increased threat of wildfires, drought, heat waves, and infectious diseases. Such disasters are expected to become more frequent and severe. Now more than ever, it is crucial to understand how these events amplify existing inequalities and how to lessen the resulting harms. Differences in human vulnerability to disasters stem from a range of social, economic, historical, and political factors. For example, in my new book, Climate Change from the Streets, I focus on environmental racism in California. I tell a story about people, place, and power in the context of climate change and inequality. I argue that the differential vulnerability to climate change impacts and climate-induced disasters across race and ethnicity are mainly a consequence of social rather than natural occurring factors. In my new research project, which I co-authored with local environmental justice and immigrant rights groups on disparate impacts of wildfire on undocumented immigrants in California, we see another key example of environmental racism in the context of disaster. We argue that given their social status, undocumented Latino and Indigenous immigrants are particularly vulnerable to disasters and require special consideration and disaster planning. They are disproportionately affected by racial discrimination, exploitation, economic hardships, less English and Spanish proficiency, and fear of deportation in their everyday lives, their pre-disaster marginalized status. Moreover, systemic racism and cultural norms determine who is a worthy disaster victim, which renders undocumented Latino and Indigenous immigrants invisible. Therefore, disparate disaster outcomes are an issue of environmental justice. On December 4th, 2017, the Thomas Fire started north of the city of Santa Paula in Ventura County, California. It grew quickly to 31,000 acres, 50 square miles, spreading into Santa Barbara County in less than 12 hours. The fire lasted over 40 days, destroying over 1,000 structures, resulting in massive blackouts, forcing more than 104,000 residents to evacuate, and causing over $2.2 billion in damage. Explosive growth was this explosive growth was driven by a combination of climate-related factors, including dry foliage, low humidity, and intense Santa Ana winds that gusted up to 60 miles per hour. At the time of final containment on January 20th, 2018, the Thomas Fire would be classified as the second largest wildfire in California history in terms of acreage. Media outlets across the country reported on the loss of hillside mansions and impacts to wealthy homeowners and farmers. The Thomas Fire, however, also endangered the health and livelihoods of thousands of undocumented Latino and Indigenous immigrants.
Michael, are you advancing your slides, and can you make it full screen, please?
Yes, can you see them?
We don't see it full screen, and people are wondering whether your slides should be advancing.
If you hit slideshow and play from current slide, it should pull up. Yep.
All right, can you see it now?
Hold on, there's a little delay. Did you hit from current slide?
Yes.
We're still seeing it in not the full screen mode.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on.
It's okay.
Okay.
Just
Try to
proceed.
get your slides, and we can see if they can move.
Okay.
Yeah.
California is home to an estimated 2.6 million undocumented immigrants, many of whom are farm workers or employed in service jobs such as housekeeping and landscaping. In Ventura and Santa Barbara counties, undocumented individuals are estimated to account for more than 9% of the population, or 111,000 people. Ventura and Santa Barbara counties are also both home to a growing Indigenous Mexican population. It is estimated that over 55,000 Indigenous Sahakian people from southern Mexico live and work in the region. In particular, Mixtecs in the area are culturally and linguistically isolated. Many are illiterate, and most speak neither Spanish nor English, but only their native language, Mixteco. And it's important to note that Mixtecs are neither Hispanic, Latino, but they're Indigenous. The Thomas Fire exposed how emergency response and recovery efforts ignore their needs of the most marginalized and stigmatized in the region. Resources were directed towards wealthy individuals, leaving local immigrant rights and environmental justice groups to provide essential services such as language access to emergency information in Spanish and Indigenous tongues, labor protections for farm workers threatened by heavy smoke, and a private disaster relief fund for undocumented immigrants ineligible for federal aid. Undocumented immigrants, particularly Indigenous individuals, usually experience socioeconomic precarity. The wildfire intensified their already difficult situation. Undocumented Latino Indigenous immigrants' differential vulnerability to disaster is mainly a consequence of structural inequality. Within a given area, these inequalities intersect along the lines of race, gender, indigeneity, immigration status, healthcare access, and income. We employ the concept of contextual vulnerability to account for these intersections between multiple human identities, social structures, and changing environments, to evaluate how they expose specific groups to greater harm and to target responses more effectively. This research examines the importance of understanding the contextual vulnerability of undocumented immigrants and responses to disasters.
Michael, we're still not seeing the slides advance.
Oh. Can you see this?
We're stuck on Ventura now. Yep, community overview of key intersectionality.
Yeah, I'm just going to leave it like that because I don't know.
Okay.
This research examines the importance of understanding the contextual vulnerability of undocumented immigrants and responses to disasters, contending that actions taken and challenges faced by community-based groups in California's Central Coast region during and after the Thomas Fire, providing the important model for more inclusive disaster planning. And to briefly go over some of the key responses and impacts that the local immigrant rights group and environmental justice groups did are the following. In terms of language access to emergency information, Ventura and Santa Barbara County, while this being California, a very diverse and progressive state, did not have anyone dedicated toward live translation for disasters. So community, undocumented immigrants in particular, and people that spoke Spanish or indigenous tongues had no language access to emergency information and other public health orders for nearly a week. So the community-based groups in the area had to do their own translations in Mixtec and Spanish and their low-power radio station and other social media platforms. After nearly 6 days, the state of California loaned a personnel to Ventura to help with live translations. Worker health and safety impacts, while people were being evacuated because of the smoke and the fire, farm workers in particular were forced to still labor in heavy smoke conditions to protect precious crops from smoke and ash, and they weren't provided with protective equipment. And you see here some of the community groups providing PPE and N95 masks, and they distributed over 10,000, I believe, during that period. Immigration status and disaster aid. Many of these individuals lost work, had health impacts, lost homes and other types of possessions. Yet because they were undocumented immigrants, they were unable to access FEMA and other state and federal disaster aid. So the community groups in this area had to do a massive fundraising campaign and fundraise $2.2 million to provide small stipends to undocumented immigrants, between $200 to $800 per household. And that $2.2 million went by quickly, and there was long waiting lists still that they weren't able to meet. There was various lessons learned from the wildfire that happened 2 years ago that impacted the COVID-19 pandemic, and is helping inform public health planning and disaster planning around that area. I'll be happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. To sum up, is that to ensure inclusive disaster planning, we need to draw on immigrant community knowledge, subsequently engage immigrant communities in disaster planning, response, or recovery ahead of the time. These are not invisible populations. They are rendered invisible because of political decisions that are being made at the local and state and federal levels. These individuals, particularly undocumented indigenous people, have been coming to this region for decades, since the 1960s. We also need to bolster Latino indigenous civil society organizations' capacity in terms of disaster relief and other planning efforts. And I have some recommendations here that are more prescriptive that I'd be happy to talk about during the Q&A. So thank you for this opportunity to be on this panel, and be waiting for the questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Next up is Aaron Sahakian. Aaron is the City of Los Angeles General Manager of the Emergency Management Department. Previously, Aaron led the City of Los Angeles Department of Transportation Special Traffic and Emergency Response Division, where he managed emergency response and major special events for over 2 decades. Aaron will speak to the reality, the view from Los Angeles. Aaron?
Hello there, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you, but I can actually see your presenter view. If you can go back and share full screen.
All right, and I am full screen on my end, so I'm not sure why you guys are not seeing it.
We're just seeing the presenter view. So if you get out of your slideshow.
Or if you just click on that little round circle that's down there where you were, and there's something that's called hide presenter view. So go to that round circle next to the, where you just, next to the little screen image. There's a round circle with 3 dots in it. Go up just a little, right there, and then do hide presenter view.
Hide presenter view. Got it.
Beautiful.
Okay. Now, do I need to go start presentation, or you guys are seeing it fine?
We see the presentation, but it's not full screen.
So go to slideshow. And then hit play from beginning. Yep.
Right. Resume slideshow, I guess. I'm clicking it, but nothing's happening.
Okay, Aram, is that your first slide showing EOC COVID-19 missions? Is that your first slide?
This is the first slide.
Okay, great. Okay, please proceed.
All right. Thank you so much for the opportunity and very interesting topic. I really thank you for putting this together. I don't know who was the brainchild behind it, but if I know Lori well, she had something to do with it. Thank you so much. It's about time that we collectively come together and start debating some of these very extremely important issues. So very quickly, let's talk about what we've been doing in LA. So I've been activated at the highest level since March 16. Highest level means approximately 120 to 150 responders from over 25, 30 agencies from throughout the city, anywhere from Bureau of Engineering, Contract Administration, Police, Fire, anybody and everybody that has a function in the response phase and recovery phase will be at the table to ensure basically seamless coordination to this terrible, terrible pandemic, right? So we are at orange level. Having said that, we're moving towards red. This morning, over the weekend, I had many Zoom meetings such as this one. The numbers are surging. It's not a secret, not only locally, nationwide and globally, the numbers are going up. This was the surge that we were fearing, and sure enough, it's here. Some of the numbers, this is our dashboard. Some of them are fed from Johns Hopkins, but if you look at LA County at the bottom left, we're approximately at 120,000, I would say, this morning. This was on Friday. We had one of our highest days, 3,063 cases on this past weekend, although the mortality rate is holding steady. And I think the reason for that is we still have capacity of ICU beds in our hospitals. Some antibiotics, some steroids are showing, good progress in fighting the disease, but we're by no means out of this. So some of the stuff that we've been doing, and if you look at the 3 columns, you look April 1st, May 1st, July 13th, it kind of shows you progress. So on April, we had 5 testing sites. We have 92 testing sites now. We had completed close to 7,000. We're pushing 1 million. Number of shelters, we went up to 22. Now we're downsizing again. These are shelters that house the homeless population, the vulnerable population within the homeless population. We had to go and identify, we had to do a field survey, identify the vulnerable population within the homeless population and move them into rec and park centers to ensure that they're protected. Disaster service worker programs, as you guys know, you're familiar with it. We had many missions that used our DSWs. Almost 4,000 are ready and working on missions right now, including contact tracing, feeding the elderly, close to, I'm gonna say we were at last 51,000 meals on a daily basis. LAUSD is another one. You know, we're almost 42 million meals now. These are some of the missions. I'm going to stop there, but I also want to remind everybody that this is only one of the disasters that we face. Looking at the Stafford Act, LA basically has every single one of them, and plus, we just finished our hazard mitigation study, and anything from earthquakes to mudslides to fires to, for God's sakes, they even identified the volcano at the tar pits, right? The problem is that in LA, we're seeing these things more and more and more. I don't care what you call it, climate change, whatever you want to call it. The trend, basically, the severity and frequency of disasters is exponentially increasing, and there's no denial in that. 17 of the largest 24 fires in California history were in the last 2 years, and this is reality. We just had almost another disaster, another Getty fire, similar to last year's during this pandemic, but luckily Santa Ana wasn't blowing. We didn't have the high winds. Otherwise, we would have had a disaster, an absolute disaster. At the same time, you know, our mass care and shelter is reimagined. Our workplaces are reimagined. It's a new approach. It's a new life. Our cooling centers this past weekend, for example, have a new protocol now. You cannot just walk into a cooling center or a shelter. You need to be checked by a nurse, your temperature, there's an interview you go through, you know, a questionnaire they ask you. Once you go inside, you're given PPEs, then there's a safety officer asking you to social distance. So it's a new norm that we need to get used to. And this is not only locally, globally you see what's happening. The last refugee numbers from UNESCO, I believe it was over $82 million. And you look at the civil wars, you look at the natural disaster, you look at the political disasters. I hate to paint this picture, but maybe my job is to paint this picture, because my job is also to ensure preparedness at the highest level, which could be accomplished only if it's a true community preparedness, and make no mistake about that. And that's what we're seeing right now at this time, something that we are failing to do. We are not holding hands together. It's chaos at its best, from the highest level of government to the lowest level of government. Politicians are blowing their own horn, hoping for a higher office down the line, or just, you know, difference of opinions, which is good. Debate is good. We need that. We need to debate. We need to have different opinions, because ultimately the outcome will be the best solution. The problem is that, you know, we keep fighting, we keep arguing, we keep, you know, pushing our own separate opinions, and that shows lack of leadership, and I don't care what you say about that. When your population in general, they're looking up and they see chaos at the highest level of government, at the local level of government, when they see your public health agencies, you know, not speaking to your, you know, city or to the federal agencies, when you see the lack of PPE equipment for one of the richest countries on this planet, you know, with one of the best economies on this planet, yet you have nurses and doctors using cellophane paper to protect themselves. That's sad. That is extremely sad. So I need to be careful not to go over the 10-minute. So these are some of the realities we're facing, the financial impact, the social economic, you know, equalities, the politics, the civil unrest that we saw recently. Obviously, that was an event within an event, but it was going to happen. You know, there's debates right now at this time in this country of civil war at some point, and that is not a joke. That needs to be taken very seriously, right? So where do we go from here? This is not just this Los Angeles. This is the whole country. We need to hold hands together. We need to prepare together as a whole community. That's been my focus for the last 4 years. with the Ready Your LA neighborhood program, where we bring communities together. We 10 to 15 households, they sit down in someone's living room. And by the way, we suspended that program because of the COVID-19. We're going all virtual right now. And I'm fairly confident that we're going to be very successful, because we're getting the phone calls from these communities now that we're on hold on preparing, and they're telling us, guys, let's do this on Zoom, let's talk about this, we need to stick together. So the ultimate goal is to take these small communities of 10 to 15 households and bring them all together, and hopefully bring the whole nation together. So we're ready to face the next, unexpected. This was a quote from the book that I loved it. I'm going to read it. As we reach out to help one another, our lives become more meaningful and satisfying. And it is so true. It is such a true statement that, we experience it. Carol and I and my team, my community preparedness team, experience it on a daily basis, pre-disaster and a post-disaster. It improves quality of life, make no mistake about it. We discovered that we don't thrive or survive alone. I'm going to end it with that. I have, I think, 12 seconds left. Thank you for the opportunity again, and I'll be ready for your questions.
Thanks very much, Aram. So our last speaker is Kathleen Tierney. Kathleen is Professor Emerita in the Department of Sociology at UC Boulder and a Fellow of the Institute of Behavioral Sciences. Many of you know her as a director of the Natural Hazards Center. She was in that position from 2003 to 2016. Her most recent book, which came out last year, is called Disasters, A Sociological Approach. Kathleen will speak to the reality, people coming together and rising up in response to ongoing injustices and repeated environmental and social shocks. Kathleen?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you and we can see you.
Okay. Am I in full screen?
Your picture is in full screen, yes.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. What a fantastic set of presentations we've heard so far. Who would have thought 6 or 7 months ago that 2020 would be marked by the emergence of a new and deadly virus, and that there would be rolling business and economic shutdowns all around the world, not long after the beginning of the new year. Here in the United States, did you or me or any of us think that the country would soon be experiencing unemployment on levels at roughly 20% of our labor force, or that May 25th, the day that George Floyd was murdered, that day would usher in a period of almost unprecedented calls for racial equality and systemic social change? Did we ever think that we would be plunged into a series of public health, economic, and societal emergencies of historic proportions? For all our talk in our community about worst cases and black swans, did we ever envision this? Once we've gotten over the shock of this, however, if indeed we have gotten over it, we see that disaster social science and social science more generally provides a lens through which we can view the current pandemic and economic crisis. We could have predicted, for example, based on our research literature, and our knowledge of the inequitable effects of disasters, that people of color and working people, now known as essential workers, would suffer and die disproportionately in the COVID epidemic. It's also no surprise that the businesses that were helped the most by relief programs like the Payroll Protection Plan are the same kinds of businesses that fare best in the aftermath of disasters, larger and better capitalized enterprises with existing connections to banking institutions, and in this particular case, businesses that could afford to hire high-paid lobbyists to make sure that they got all the money they thought they had coming to them. On the other hand, we don't see help for the very small, the woman and minority-owned businesses, the underbanked businesses. These are the ones that are going to have the most difficulty recovering if they survive at all in the aftermath of this pandemic. And when the data are finally available and the impacts and the losses are all assessed, I think the general public is going to be astonished at these kinds of outcomes, but our community will not be. We know this all too well. These impacts were predictable and they were also avoidable. It didn't have to be this way, and many of our discussions at the workshop this time are going to be about why it didn't have to be this way. But what I want to really talk about here, and what again comes from our research on disasters and other types of social science research, is what can give us cause for hope in the midst of despair. And in my way of thinking, some of this hope relates to the relationship between the state and civil society in crisis situations. And when I talk about the state, I'm not talking about the state of Colorado or California or New York. I'm talking about the state as an institutional system of governance, administrations, agencies, laws, and regulations, for example. And of course, we all know what I mean when I talk about civil society. I'm referring here to ordinary people and the organizations and the institutions that they've built, the nonprofits, the faith-based organizations, the community-based organizations, and social movements, for example. And what we've seen, I think, over the last few months, as well as what we've seen over time in disasters, is tremendous variation in the capacity of states to manage crisis. Like any major or catastrophic disaster, the COVID-19 epidemic is a crisis that many state systems had a very difficult time initially trying to manage. Some countries like New Zealand and South Korea and Singapore have been containing the virus through aggressive and effective state actions. Others, like the United States and Brazil, have not done so, and unfortunately probably won't do so going forward. However, in all cases, as in disasters, we've seen a tremendous growth in action on the part of civil society. In fact, there is no state on earth that has been able to respond effectively to the virus without the enthusiastic participation of civil society, ranging from widespread compliance with guidance for keeping safe to actively providing support and assistance to those in need. And just as in disasters, during the pandemic, civil society has mobilized to do what states cannot do on their own, to volunteer, to offer mutual aid at the local level, the neighborhood level, and at larger scales, to donate goods, to donate funds, to donate services. And at a time of social distancing and isolation, civic institutions are providing a massive array of cultural, educational, and recreational experiences, remotely and quite often for free. Now, we know and we can see that civil society engagement is not always positive at times of crisis like this. Societal divisions can undermine the power of civil society, but on balance, it is civil society rather than state systems alone that is saving us. Disasters, and here I include the current pandemic, represent situations in which the state cannot address all of the disaster-related needs and demands. However, there are other kinds of crisis situations in which states refuse to address the needs and demands of many segments of their populations. Think of South Africa under apartheid, states around the globe that oppress indigenous people, and the United States under slavery, Jim Crow, and the new Jim Crow. Similar to disasters, in cases where states refuse to act, individuals, organizations, and institutions that comprise civil society spring into action when conditions are right. We saw civil society at work in the fall of the Soviet Union, in the Arab Spring, recently in the Hong Kong democracy demonstrations, and in many other people power movements. It's currently happening around the world with groups like the Sunrise Movement, youth confronting nation states and the international community and demanding solutions to the threat of climate change. In cases where states literally exist to prop up unjust social and economic systems, civil society groups have no choice but to act outside of and to challenge state institutions. Civil society mobilization takes a variety of forms: oppositional movements, demonstrations, protest marches, strikes, civil disobedience, lawsuits, and so on. This is the only option for civil society when the state refuses to respond to cries for justice. This is where our society in the United States finds itself at this point of time with respect to systemic racism and a racialized social order. But here again, there is hope. According to an article that came out in the New York Times about 2 weeks ago, based on social surveys and other empirical research, the Black Lives Matter protests and the demonstrations that have happened so far this summer are probably the largest wave of civil protest in the history of the United States, with an estimated 15 to 26 million people involved in protests, taking part in marches and demonstrations. And those protests are already having very significant effects. And more cause for hope. The political scientist Erica Chenoweth at Harvard, and here I'll give a shout out to the University of Colorado because she got her PhD at CU Boulder. She has found in her worldwide research that nonviolent civil society mobilization involving only 3.5% of the population of a country is sufficient to obtain concessions from repressive government regimes. Now, I'm not saying that we place all our hope in civil society. There are things that only states can do. And whether we're talking about the New Deal, which pulled the United States out of the Great Recession, or whether we're talking about actions of states in the global system, following the global financial calamity of 2008, state action is critical. And we also see the consequences of state inaction in cases like Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, and in the pandemic in this country. To wrap up, Rebecca Solmet is one of my favorite writers, and most of us in our community know her from her beautiful tribute to civil society and disasters, the book called A Paradise Built in Hell. But earlier she wrote another important book called Hope in the Dark. And that was about how aspirations for a better and more just society can be sustained even in times of great uncertainty, pain, suffering, and state repression, if we are willing to move forward. And more recently, she's written this, and I'm going to quote this, quote, "Hope locates itself in the premise that we don't know what will happen, and that in the spaciousness of uncertainty, there is room to act." And she also reminds us that with robust civil society actions, like we see in disasters in the current pandemic and in struggles for racial justice, that what can happen and what is indeed already happening, and here I quote again, ideas at first considered outrageous or ridiculous or extreme can become what people think they've always believed, unquote. Freer, very inexpensive healthcare for all, the eradication of racial injustice, aggressive global action to respond to the existential threat of climate change are just some of these ideas. We can only hope, but hope without action is meaningless and hollow. So let us hope, but let us also act. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen, for really bringing it home there and taking us into the idea of action. So now it's time for the Q&A period. So far, I see at least one question that's come up. It's from Omar. Omar says, I have a question for all the panelists. We already know the importance of combining many fields to be able to address disaster in an intersectional manner. How can we integrate those fields on the ground when we have government responses that only focus on the structural recovery, but not necessarily on social resources? Natalie, you brought up intersectionality. Would you like to take that on first?
Sure, and I appreciate that question. I think it requires engagement and a mind shift. So in the spirit of public health practice, meeting people where they're at and helping them, that being the emergency management community, to really understand our language or that thing that is different that they may not have been exposed to and may not have awareness of. I've found that when I am able to translate my issues into their language, there comes understanding. And from that understanding comes a recognition that through what they're seeking to achieve, if they cannot address some of these areas that were blind spots to them, then they will not actually get to that optimized state that they're seeking. So I think there's a translational element. There is a practice-based sort of community meeting, and I think that's going to be the challenge overall. I've heard some of the other speakers really hit on the topic of how do we translate this understanding, this awareness into action? How do we not just say this is an observation and move into that translational element of the work and the practice? So I would say that for me, it is literal, like language translation, the vernacular, and having a common platform where we can approach each other and understand the various viewpoints, and then taking that understanding into those concrete deliverables such that people understand in order to get, you can't get from here to there absent that that engagement.
Thanks, Natalie. Would anybody else like to weigh in on that question? If not, we can move on to another question, but I wanted to give an opportunity to anybody else that's on the line.
Sure.
Michael?
I think one of the biggest things is to really understand that there's the situation of preparedness. How do we reach out to these communities in a substantive manner? In the case study of undocumented immigrants and indigenous immigrants is that they knew these people were there for decades. And the local governments there decided not to substantively involve any of the community groups, the community leaders, and how to prepare these communities. Subsequent to the fire now, the community organizations are now invited to some of these task force meetings, some of the VOADs or the voluntary disaster relief task force meetings, but they were never invited before. So I think really targeting resources and identifying these communities and trying to build these relationships before a disaster is how you really operationalize this in practice.
Thanks, Michael. Aram, were you raising your hand?
I was, yes. Just one thing on this topic is that the biggest issue that I see right now is that policy and solutions are being designed without input from the ground level, without input from the emergency management family. If you are going to have a solution, they need to be realistic, they need to be achievable. You will need the logistics to achieve these goals, and not just come down and say, do as I say, this is what we want to see, and then you fail because you don't have the tools to do it, the timeline is not realistic, they haven't received your input on it, and you end up wasting a lot of resources and money, honestly. So this is something that I want to get across.
Thanks, Aram. Anyone else on the panel like to weigh in? If not, we'll move on to another question. Yeah, did I hear somebody? Yeah, please.
I would like to just mention one thing.
Yeah.
The extraordinarily high rate of death of African Americans as a result of COVID has prompted the first wave of attention. For example, in Louisiana, we have a commission now to study the causes. My cynicism is, will it last? Will it grow? Will it have teeth? Will it do the kinds of things that the other panelists are talking about? Or is it just window dressing and it will go away? So I'm very cynical, very concerned.
Yep. Thanks. Let's move on to another question. It starts off with a statement. The pandemic response and recovery is divided by safety and economy. Experts are debating whether the supply chain needs to be restructured so that nations maintain their most essential supply chains at home. But like criticality, how do we determine what is most essential for all purposes? And how does that change affect developing countries? Would anybody like to weigh in on that, please? No takers?
Wow.
Yeah.
That is a huge question.
Yeah.
And some of the supply chain issues that have emerged show us a little bit of the downside of globalization itself. Does there need to be a restructuring? Probably. What will the implications be for the nations, for example, of the global South? That is anybody's guess. I mean, what's really being raised here is not something that can be answered in this session. It's a major research question.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, Aram, were you raising your hand?
Yes. So the supply chain, the global supply chain that we're facing right now does not have contingencies at the local level. When you run out of N95s and I'm placing an order of a couple of million of them, and I need to wait 30 days, 60 days, because it's coming from China and they're sitting at the dock, and then they get confiscated at the last second, I have a problem. And for me to retool my local industry to immediately start giving me the logistics that I need to save lives, and that's taking 2 to 3 months, that's a problem. That's an issue. So as much as globalization has its advantages, it also has its disadvantages. And especially you're seeing this specifically in the supply chain, and the pharma supply chain being one of them. Some of the other supply chains, such as, you know, fuel and transportation, water, maybe they're a little different, but when it came to this specific topic, it wasn't pretty.
Thanks, Aram. Anybody else like to weigh on this? If not, we can move on to another question. Okay. I think a lot of great points were made about community engagement and civil society. My question, how do we go about assessing community capability in a way that allows us in local emergency management to supplement their capabilities? Workable specifics are appreciated here. Wow, that's another difficult one. Would anybody else like to weigh in on that, please? Yeah, Aram.
That's an easy one. That's not a difficult one. That's an easy one. You need to practice your plan. It's as simple as that. So when you bring a community and you give them the tools to prepare as a community, and by the way, one of the questions they asked me about dry land is that, you know, is it still working during a pandemic situation? Absolutely, it's working during a pandemic situation. Neighbors are checking on each other. You have neighbors leaving food in front of the doors of seniors and knocking out the door, so you know they're ensured that they're well taken care of. Of course, it's working, but you need to ensure that you practice the plan, because it's the only way you are going to look at the gaps and you are going to correct them. And I'll give you an example where we have an area called Atwater Village. Howard, maybe you're familiar with it since you're familiar with Glendale, not too far from us. So there were at least 20 to 22 communities that they had prepared on their own, you know, with the help of the Red Cross, with our help, to put their plan together. And the plan, it's not just a first aid kit bucket you buy on Amazon that turns into a toilet seat. No, It has a communication plan. It identifies the daycare center. It identifies a refuge site where this community needs to go. It identifies who's going to pick up the kids, you know, for that community if there's an incident during the day. So the list goes on, and it's posted online at our website, and you know, you can take a look at it. So once the community at the local level, individually as a exercise, the next step was to bring all these communities together. So the Atwater hillside had over 60 individual Ryland plans. So once they came together, then the whole picture, approximately, you know, a couple of thousand people started exercising the plans that they had put together. And what we saw on that weekend was mind-boggling for all of us. And Carol was out there walking the street. I was out there walking the street. These people, these communities, they came together. They had an earthquake scenario that they built. They went out at night. They posted signs of damages on, you know, the chimneys, the driveways, the staircases. And the next day, they played it as a whole community. They started at 8 a.m. and they ended at 11 p.m. And at 11 p.m., you had over 50 people sitting in someone's home doing an afterwash, an after-action report, and identified issues that they were fixed the next day. You don't even see that in government, I'll be honest with you. So these communities single-handedly came together, people of all colors, right? And they came together to show us, to teach a lesson to me, my department, and the government that, you know what, we're the first responders. We don't expect you to be here right after an earthquake within, you know, half an hour. It could take 72 hours. It could take, you know, 7 days, 2 weeks. Give us the tools. We'll prepare and we'll save the day. Not only will save the day, we will save also your butt when it comes to it.
Thank you, Aram. Would anybody else like to chime in?
Yeah, I think, again, it's going back to building those relationships. I think Aram provides an excellent example of a diverse community, but a very economically and privileged community at Atwater at the same time. But there's other communities that won't participate in such type of events. So I think it's the onus is also on the government to how do you reach these difficult populations, building those relations with community organizations, and also not always asking people to volunteer their time, but also provide substantive funding for these community-based organizations that have more trust than local government, the police, and other first responders to be able to develop these plans that are culturally and linguistically specific to their communities. Because some governments don't want to protect these communities. For instance, recently in the COVID-19 pandemic, we see the governor of Florida blaming on farm workers and undocumented immigrants for the rise of cases. So again, understanding that those people in power, not just the people on the ground that are disaster relief analysts and organizers, but also understanding their top leadership that may have racist intentions that prevent direct resources to target it to these invisible, quote unquote, invisible populations. So understanding how do you reach those communities, and also not expecting them to provide free labor all the time and provide funding for these community-based organizations to work with local and state governments.
Thanks, Michael. Any other panelists like to weigh in on this?
Yes, I think following up on comments that have already been made, organizing members of the community is very important, but it's also important for members of vulnerable and marginalized groups to gain political power. I mean, one of the problems with, you know, getting help from politicians for undocumented immigrants is that they don't vote. And I think we have the Lowlander Center here represented by Shirley, which is a phenomenal example of the way that marginalized communities can empower themselves politically and get things for themselves politically. Another example would be, you know, after Katrina and the Vietnamese community in New Orleans East organized around the Catholic Church there, exercising and organizing and demanding recognition. So it's relationship building, but it's also the building of political power, so that people get the things they need before, during, and after disasters.
Thanks, Kathleen. Another question. I think Shirley's point is so important about whether the research going on right now is going to translate into meaningful change or impact. Something we have to do as researchers is really grapple with our legacy of doing research, and there all too often being minimal tangible impact to the community. How can we change that? How can we become truly useful? These are questions that I struggle with. Would anybody like to remark on that?
So this is Natalie, and
Hi,
I'll
Natalie.
turn over to Shirley shortly. I literally had a conversation with colleagues over at the National Institutes of Health on this exact topic this morning. And for them, it is beyond just translational research now. And there was an article that came out from Francis Collins that really spoke to the necessity of moving the research science from this observational space into something that is practical, actionable, tangible, that incorporates the fullest sense of the communities, that does not treat them as subjects to be observed, rather that the community of practice of scientists that are located within that impacted jurisdiction are identifying in concert with the community members the strategies ahead. So to the point that was made earlier by, actually by you, Howard, when we started off this session, about how we really frame up the issue and where the science-based community can contribute within their area of expertise. I think from my perspective, it's really challenging for certain scientists to go and meet people where they're at in that space, that if they're not social scientists or otherwise. I'm a biochemist by training, so it took me a long time to move from that space into a different space. So I understand that challenge, but I think that's the absolute necessity, because when I'm reviewing the literature, when I'm seeing what that means, and then drawing the thread about how does that relate to the situation that I'm encountering in XYZ jurisdiction right now, I can see that because I've spent a lot of time trying to train myself towards it. I think the challenge comes in when we produce the material, the research, and we don't similarly have the partners through which we can carry that thread to the action. And that's really where the hope that may be generated by the research and the understanding is lost, because we don't have the translation into the action that was mentioned by the speakers.
Thanks, Natalie. Shirley?
Academics and nonprofit organizations have a vested interest in the research that they do. Excuse me. And it doesn't always, or many times, parallel the interests of the communities. So we are asked to speak for communities, and we have gotten into a knee-jerk reaction of saying, why would you ask us when you have the communities right here present and able to participate? I'll give you an example that really horrified us, but the outcome was good. A national organization funded us to study the communities after the BP oil spill. And the person who was directing us from headquarters told us that he had to have us do a survey. Well, we approached the communities we work with and they laughed. They said, well, you could share it with us and we'll just pick A, B, C, or D with our eyes closed, because this is useless in terms of representing the experiences that we're having. So fortunately, I was at the university then, and the lawyer who oversaw the contracts put into our contract that we had the right to use the data, even if the national funder did not approve of the methodology. So what we did is we had each community, a member of it, do internal interviews of the members of their community with regard to the impacts of the BP spill. And that's where we first started recognizing layering, and we first started recognizing the fact that victims of oil spills have to posture as victims, where if you've been subject to a hurricane, you just brush yourself off, get up and go forward. But they couldn't do that when they were begging for the BP money. So we're really pretty adamant, you know, don't bother us to be the go-between between academics and the communities if in fact it isn't going to be a co-research, which I think Natalie is talking about too, where we're not studying the community together with Lowlander are studying the issue. It's called PAR, it exists, we didn't invent it, but it certainly has its benefits, we think, to all of us, you know.
Thanks, Shirley.
I'd like to add
Michael,
that
yeah.
I think the importance of having community-based co-authors, because in engaging this project, I really thought about the ethics of doing disaster research and understood to be able to give the community members their own voice and their own authorship to this type of research. And together we do our briefings to the governor's office of California and to various other state and local entities. And together we provide a very strong voice and unifying voice that otherwise as an academic I could not bring, or them alone could not bring on just by themselves. So I think there's this idea of the reciprocity to make sure that we're telling the right story and they have ownership of that story as well, as we try to engage in the advocacy, policy advocacy part of this project as well.
Thanks, Michael. Would anybody else like to weigh in on that? So here's another question. It's phrased as can we, but maybe I'll turn it into a different type of question. Should we build preparedness and resilience into the academic curriculum in K-12? We found in New York after the underground gas explosion that information brought home from school children was important to parents taking the appropriate actions. Would anybody like to weigh in on that? Yeah, Aram.
I mean, again, it's a no-brainer. Of course, the answer, but I'm going to have Carol chime in and answer this question if you don't mind.
Hi, Carol. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's been an incredible panel. So many things to keep in mind, but to answer the question, definitely yes. We've seen over the years that parents are very aware of the need to be prepared, but when the message is brought home through their children, they tend to take action. So if little Joe or Sally says, Mommy, we need to do this, parents tend to do it. So the challenge has been in incorporating preparedness in the curriculum. We've tried it here in Los Angeles when I started back in 1998. I mentioned to our LAUSD representative, said, how can we integrate preparedness into the curriculum? And he said, Carol, incredible idea, but teachers simply don't have the time. They're already jam-packed with the core curriculum that it's very difficult to weave it in. So I agree, we need to be creative and find solutions. The need is great, and preparedness does start with the individual household. So if there are others who would like to collaborate on best solutions that we can achieve this, I would love to partner with you to bring about change.
Thanks, Carol. Would anybody else like to chime in on that? So we have a lot of wonderful comments in here, but in scanning them, maybe I've missed a few questions, but I think we've pretty much gone through the questions. Yes?
I want to just touch, I saw a question about the definition of vulnerability.
Yes. Okay, please.
And I wanted to engage with that and invite my colleagues similarly to comment on that. I think a few things. I think that vulnerability as a phrase has this particular connotation that I need to save you. That is really tricky within the emergency management space. I think what it fails to, and we've had these debates and are still ongoing at the federal level in terms of a definition of term, what constitutes vulnerable populations, vulnerable communities, and what are those key considerations. I think now is a very good time to challenge what that means, what that term really means, and how it's translated, and into the type of support and engagement, empowerment, and looking at it from how do we positively reinforce those elements of a community that are strong that we might not know or acknowledge, and really support and advance that, as opposed to looking at the community, again, outsider looking in, as something that requires sort of a white knight savior complex type of thing. So that's not to say that they may not need additional resources. It's about how that conversation really comes about, and understanding, you know, within the scope of this particular type of disaster or these disasters and emergencies, heck, even day to day, we know certain things that you are not in an optimized condition, and we want to have a conversation about that. I'll stop there, but I invite my colleagues to comment further.
So we have about a little bit less than a minute. So if anybody else would like to make a concise comment about that, that would be very welcome. Thank you. If not, I think basically we're coming to the conclusion of this absolutely amazing panel in this session. I don't know about you, but I've learned an awful lot. The diversity of the panel has been incredibly valuable in this text, having the practitioners, having the academics, having the people that are on the ground, and the people in government. It's really been a wonderful potpourri of perspectives. So this plenary session was really about taking stock of the grim realities that we face, but also we heard a lot of hopeful things too. That was really nice to hear. Active hope lays out why we have to ground ourselves in that reality, but also how overwhelming that can be. So step one, the reality we face, that's really just the beginning. The next two plenary sessions in Tuesday morning will help us understand, once we have that reality we drafted and clarified, how can we set a vision and take individual and collective steps to get there? Thanks so much for your attention and great comments and questions. The questions and comments are being archived, and we can ask the panelists to weigh in on answers to some of the questions that we've been unable to answer during the limited amount of time. I'd especially like to thank each of our panelists, Natalie, Shirley, Michael, Aram, and Kathleen, for their thought-provoking, outstanding presentations. And finally, I'd like to thank Lori for giving me the opportunity to contribute and moderate this outstanding panel. Lori, over to you.
Howard, thank you so much for your leadership and coordination with this panel. And RM, Natalie, Shirley, Kathleen, and Mike, thank you for the thought-provoking comments and for grounding us in our present reality, while also, as Howard said, giving us hope for thinking about moving forward. Kathleen, at the beginning of your comments, you said, who would have thought when we turned the calendar on 2020 that we would be where we are on July 13th? And here we are. And something that is buoying me right now is knowing that you all are there and helping to lead us forward through this. So thank you. And something that I'm really sitting with right now that I'm really missing is the huge round of applause that I know our panelists would be receiving right now. And so thank you to all of you in the chat box who are giving love and gratitude to this panel, because they deserve it and have earned it. So thank you. And before we turn to our lunch break, in these last 2 minutes, I have a couple of announcements that I want to share with all of you, because this is going to be the last time we're all together today. And so just a couple of quick announcements. Yesterday, we had 2 outstanding training sessions in the early afternoon, followed by 2 more outstanding training sessions. And one of those training sessions was actually a career Kickstarter and a job seekers training session. And Lindsay Davis from the US Geological Survey has been expertly leading this for the last couple of years. And one of the things that she set up this year, given our virtual environment, was a Google document where those with jobs could share those jobs, as well as job seekers can go to the Google document and share about your time, talent, and expertise. And so we hope you will please take advantage of that. That is up on the Natural Hazards Center website. We also, in the interest of our practitioner audience, wanted to let you know that thanks to a partnership with the Association of State Floodplain Managers, we can offer 12 pre-approved continuing education credits. And thanks to a partnership with the International Association of Emergency Managers, up to 19 contact hours towards your certified or associate emergency manager certification. And so please check that out. And then last announcement, this evening, we will have a virtual poster session from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. Mountain, but you can go and see the 90+ posters that are up in the Feedloop portal anytime you choose. And I really encourage you to do this. These are extraordinary. Not only are they posters, people have made videos, they have written texts, and I hope you will go check out the incredible storehouse of knowledge that is up there. So please join us this evening and any time throughout the workshop with the poster session. And with that, I want to thank again our opening plenary for the brilliant remarks that you shared. And right now we're going to take a 90-minute break. I hope it's restorative for all of you. And then we'll join again at 1:30 p.m. Mountain Time with 6 different concurrent session offerings. And so everyone have a good break, and thank you again to our panel, and thank you for everyone being here today.